everyone, and welcome back to Reading Crossbow. My name is Lana, and as always, I'm here with my amazing buddy Rob.
Hey, Lana, and hello, everyone else. And I'm excited to talk about some books today, specifically our new one.
Yes, Serpent Dove by Shelby Mahurin was my pick this month. And if you haven't heard it yet, you should go back to last week's episode and listen to Robert's Halfway, because that's how we do this show. We always have an episode to pick out and introduce the books we're reading for the month. And then we each do each other's like kind of halfway reviews, followed by both of us doing the full review. So that's what we're doing today. Full review on Serpent and Dove. And I'm hoping you liked it, but I'm actually going to guess that we're going to each have some mixed reviews today.
Okay.
I could be wrong.
Well, I see you have, is that the whole trilogy right there?
So I happen to have the whole trilogy, and I put this out here, and I wanted you to know, I needed to preface this. I watched your halfway. So I don't know where you're going to go with this, but I didn't buy this one, all right? I have a beloved friend, she's amazing, who reads far more than I do, and she's the one I was mentioning when I was trying to pick the books for, this month, that she sent me these. So she sends me books that she's done with, or books that she's bought, like the pretty covers too. So some of our listeners might know there's an amazing company out there. It's called, I think it's Fable. There's actually a bunch of them where they make like specialty versions of books that are gorgeous. So I think she got the gorgeous ones and sent me the, but anyway, so I have the trilogy. I guess we'll discuss on whether or not I'm going to finish the trilogy.
Yeah, I was actually really kind of excited because I saw that the next book was called Blood and Honey, and all I could picture in my head was that horror Winnie the Pooh movie. And I was like,
oh no.
And I was like, wow, that did not line up for this author to have that come out and use the exact same name.
Oh my gosh. Well, and with this one, we'll get into the magic, but I know it's like a sweeter version of the magic. I think that heals. But that's, quick summary of this book. So this book is about two main characters, Louise, who goes by Lou, and Reed. One of these characters is a witch, and the other character just happens to be a chasseur, which is a witch hunter. So basically, I know we're going to cover this, but through fated events, if you will, they end up having to they get married, and he doesn't know that she's a witch. Oh no. And so they have to overcome this, go through a big adventure along the way. She's got a naughty, evil mother who's basically trying to kill her. And we, as the readers, will find out if he's going to help her or let her die at the hands of her mother. So that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, that was a pretty, good explanation for this book. And it was a lot of interesting kind of things about this book, especially like the way the magic is handled, the kind of tropes that get covered by this book. So it was a very interesting read.
So something that you might not know, and I'm glad you brought up tropes and different types of story types, is I've actually never read like a witch's story. I've watched plenty of movies, I guess The Witcher might count. I read some of those short stories, but never have I ever experienced a witch story. So what about you and all of your reading?
I think the closest I've ever done, it was a book by R.A. Salvatore called Child of a Mad God, where the main character was they call it a coven, but it's very evil and dark magic. But the magic worked quite a bit differently than in this book. This book is far more of a traditional witch tropes. And that was actually really kind of fun to read, is getting to see those tropes.
And I really thought, like, all I've really seen is like kind of more like your silly movie about witches where they have to have a magic book and a spell, and they're looking up the spells, and sometimes they're mixing potions. And we do get a little bit of that in this in terms of potions in particular and spell work sort of, but that was very different to me how they handled the spell work. So that was surprising. We'll cover that when we get to magic, but I'm glad you brought up tropes because we're going to start off this episode in true YA fashion, and we're going to discuss tropes first, which is something we haven't really done on this show. So there's two particular tropes that show up in this book that YA readers, really love to kind of love or hates. And there's a lot of tropes in YA fantasy, but in particular, we had forced proximity, which I really want to discuss because you brought this up in your halfway episode, but you related it to The Martian, which is very interesting. And your classic enemies to lovers, which you also brought up in your halfway episode, which is perfect for me on this episode. But let's start with forced proximity. So anybody new to YA and haven't heard of that, it's basically when two characters are forced into a situation together. I typically tend to love forced proximity stories. We've read a lot of like these war college stories, and that's one of the ways this happens is they're stuck in a dorm room together, or they're stuck in a classroom together. Or there's like a, their military leader and they're servicing under them, things like that. But in this story, it's kind of odd. The forced proximity happens due to this unfortunate event that causes our two main characters to become married. Now, you talked a lot about that in your halfway, but how do you feel in general about forced proximity trope?
So I did talk about it last episode, and I don't want to rehash it too much, but the general thought is this is actually kind of a core element to this story. We just need to get these characters together, and we might have to suspend some disbelief and just get it to happen so that we can move on with the actual story of these two very opposite personalities having to learn to be friendly and possibly even fall in love with each other. And I don't know, I think the trope is fine. It fits within a lot of, popular media even. How many movies, the love story is basically just two people that were stuck together for the course of the movie, and by the end, are kissing during the credits.
Well, I just tend to love forced proximity, but I like it when it happens kind of more naturally. And we're going to, let our readers come to, terms with this, discuss it in the comments if you will. But I felt in particular that this forced proximity happened in a way that could have been done better. But I agree with you, and am so glad you brought up suspended disbelief, because this happens a lot in YA, where there's almost always a part in the books where we just have to be like, oh, that's the poof moment. Okay, well, the story is now fused. We can move along on our journey.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's done well, and sometimes it's not. And in this book, the forced proximity was kind of like, you're going to do it that way? Alrighty then. And you have to suspend a disbelief and be like, well, that happened. We're going on the journey now. Okay.
Yeah. And we've covered that several other books during this show, like Dragonfall and Fourth Wing. Both forced the two characters to essentially be in each other's lives.
So let's move on to the next one, which is enemies to lovers. This one for me is probably like, if I had a scale of like love it, hate it, I'm sort of in the middle. I don't have to have enemies to lovers, but it's all right. I'm fine with the general trope as long as it's done well. How did you feel about the enemies to lovers trope in this book?
It's one of those where only one person actually is aware that they're enemies. The other person is not. And this essentially did also happen like during Fourth Wing. So I think the trope is a little misattributed because one character is completely unaware that they're supposed to be enemies.
That's the one part that I kind of disagreed with in your halfway, because I thought they were so clearly enemies to me. So this came across very much like, yep, you're the enemy. Yep, you are too. And even though one character was hiding information, the basis of it from the front was definitely enemies to lovers. And then there's a little twist in there too later.
Yeah, and what I mean is just basically he's not aware that she's a witch. They are kind of enemies when they first are forced to be married, but he's not even aware that she's a witch, but she's very aware that he is a witch hunter. So that's
True.
kind of what
Okay.
I was kind of leaning towards. So, but I guess, yeah, I don't know. I found the enemies to lovers, because one character is very much aware that they're supposed to be enemies, is kind of a lot more dickish to the other one.
True.
Whereas
she
the other one
doesn't really let him
Yeah.
love her.
Whereas he's trying. He's like, well, we're stuck. We might as well try. And she's like, I'm going to push your buttons at every opportunity.
Yes, which is great segue into we're actually gonna do the rating now of different sections of the book. We're gonna save the rating for the book till the end, but it's important to not skip there if you're listening to this and hear how we rate each section. So characters. Actually, there's two main characters, Lou and Reed, and then a bunch of secondary characters, but a few that stand out highlight. How did you feel about the characters in Serpent and Dove?
So I would say I connected a lot more with the Reed character during the first half of the book. I found him to be a lot more relatable, not as grating and irritating. But about halfway through, it completely flipped, and I was completely on Lou's side because he became the very grating and irritating one. And it was like, and it was just the way they were essentially reacting to the situations that they were in. So I really enjoyed one for the one half of the book, and I enjoyed the other one for the other half of the book.
Well, that's interesting. Like that's super interesting. Yeah. I'm used to like YA female leads being annoying. Um, Especially if they have some sort of gift, or often in YA they find it later, they get magical powers later, especially if they're a 17-year-old with some 300-year-old elf, which by the way, I'm so glad we didn't have that trope in this book. The characters are very close in age, thank goodness. Yeah, I'm used to the female leads actually being somewhat grating. They're usually a bit like difficult, and I don't know why that is. Like, I would like that to stop.
Yeah, I think in the case of her, it's about defeminizing her to basically make her feel more like a strong female character by basically giving her more aggressive traits. Whereas in the second half, he was getting the negative side of all those same traits. He was becoming overprotective, over conservative, as far as like the way he was behaving towards her once. And so I think they were just emphasizing certain traits to push out whatever they were trying to get you to feel.
Okay, so let's dive into those characters a little bit more for people who are thinking about reading this book. So just real quickly, Lou basically runs away from her coven, if you will. I don't know that they use the word coven in this book, but maybe I think they do. And for a mysterious reason that we really don't know at the beginning, but it comes pretty clear. And she's like, she goes from this kind of privileged, very well cared for life to living on the streets at like age 16. And by the time Reed finds her, I can't remember how old she is, but I think 18. Because, yes, she's been on the streets for like 2 years. And in just 2 years, she's suddenly gone from like pampered, privileged, like taken care of, to like hardened street criminal. And maybe 2 years is enough, but perhaps overdone on the character in that regard. But that's her attitude. She's had to fight, she's had to steal, she lives above an abandoned theater, she steals clothes from the theater closet, and she's kind of this like rough and tumble character. And then Reed is an orphan, and he was abandoned and basically taken in by the church. And it's very common in this city that boys are orphaned for some reason, and which we know. We're trying not to spoil though. And he basically becomes a chasseur, so trained to become a soldier, and then the highest elite level soldiers can become a chasseur, which is a witch killer, and they're granted this magical knife that can kill witches. So that's kind of the two characters in a nutshell.
Yeah, and one thing that I just found to be very just weird is he's a chasseur, which is just the word for witch hunter, and she constantly just refers to him as Chas. And it's kind of like if your significant other was a baker and you just referred to them as Bake, or your significant other was a police officer and you called him Pole. It's a weird pit name.
I liked it, but I think the language here is French. I feel that we'll get to this in the setting, but it's very French. And so I liked that part a lot, but it just shows the disrespect in her as a character. He's very pious, very devout, with some exceptions. He very much believes in what he's doing, what the church wants him to do. I should say the Chessers belong to the church. There's an archbishop that he looks to as a father. And then some secondary characters are Lou's best friend, Coco, who's also a witch, but from a different coven. So she's a blood witch. She does magic with blood.
And then Ansel, the kind of young up and coming chasseur, who is almost set up as a potential romantic rival for a bit.
Yeah, Ansel was great. I actually loved that character. But so, in terms of characters, I'm going to have you choose your best one, your favorite one, and then rate the characters in general for Serpent and Dove.
I would say for characters, I think the character I liked the most was actually Ansel. He shows the most, despite the fact he's the far youngest person in the circle, he almost shows the most wisdom of anyone in the group. He can recognize, things that just are everyone else is oblivious to. He is able to compromise on stronger moral positions because he sees the ethics of a situation. I just liked his character a lot more. He kind of was a fresh component of any scene he was in.
And how would you rate the characters?
The characters as a whole, I would say 2.
2. Wow. Okay. I don't think I'm that far off though, but I wasn't expecting a 2. But all right. Okay, so I'm gonna agree with you. Ansel was great. Fantastic. A lot of character development there. Goes from this kind of stuttering young boy who can't quite get words out, especially in front of Lou, who's really pretty. He realizes she's a witch actually somewhat earlier on, like much earlier than Reed does. So he's actually kind of carrying the secret with him. And then Coco, who's another secondary character. I thought some of her choices were poor, but she was just kind of fun. She's kind of rough and tumble, but in a better way. Like she's like, she finds a prince at one point just at a party and she's like, hey, baby. And like, kind of like bringing him to, she like flirts with everyone. And I just thought that was like, just fun. It was a fun element, added some brevity in moments that were like more difficult to the story. So yeah, in terms of rating the characters, when the lead characters aren't my favorites, that automatically drops them down. So I would give the lead characters a 2. Especially because Lou's whiny. She's so whiny. And she reminds me of like Keva from Gunmetal Gods, where he's just like, come on, get over it already. Your mom's a bitch. We get it.
Yeah.
And Reed is just a bit too like paladin on his way.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. So
he falls with the lawful stupid trope. In gaming, because he's just so pious that he basically is oblivious to anything outside of his very, very narrow worldview.
Yes, and in his past it talks about he did fall in love once, but I think he fell in love because he's just like, he's the church boy who never fell in love before. It's like the first girl and he like loved her. Yeah. This is all pre-Lou and it's part of the beginning stages of the setup for the story. But so yeah, definitely that kind of, I'm gonna do what's right, paladin, and it's just so silly and dumb. So yeah, main characters get a 2. Secondary characters for me are 3, 4. I'm gonna put them, the whole characters, out of 3.
Okay.
Which takes us to setting. We're not going to spend as much time on setting today because we're going to spend some more time on magic and the story. But setting, I know is important to you. How did you feel?
I felt like there was a big missed opportunity here. This setting is a hybrid of a fantasy world and the real world. The religion practiced in this world is very much just Christianity. So that places it within our world. And yet the country that the story takes place is a made-up, a fictional country that apparently has no relations with any other place in the world, although they kind of speak French. So I feel like there was a missed opportunity. They should have just leaned into one way or the other. It just took a middle path that I wouldn't recommend. Either be in the real world and have fantasy elements, or be in a fantastical world. One or the other. Like, this middle path is my least favorite.
Yeah, and I had a hard time picturing the setting. It was just a city, any old city. I could pick up this story and plop it in any old city with a castle and a kingdom. And the coolest part by far was like how the covens live, which is they live in kind of shrouded secrecy. They use magic to keep themselves away from, non-practicing people, the humans. I don't know if other witch covens can see other witch covens. That's not really talked about in this first book, maybe in others. But like even when I don't feel like they described the city very well. I don't feel like they described the land very well. At one point they traveled between, kingdom to a coven, and we don't get a ton of that they walk through a forest basically, and that's
Yeah.
a whole troublesome scene too when we get there. But yeah, setting was just
Yeah.
how would you rate it?
It's a 1.
One. Okay. Yeah. Two. Two
Okay.
for me, because the coven saves it a bit, and that can up it a bit for me. But yeah,
Yeah, that was
sorry, Shelby.
okay. So what do you have next?
All right, so we are going to talk about my favorite part. I know yours too, which is magic. And you had a lot to discuss in your halfway anyway. So if you guys are just watching us for the first time, make sure to go back and check out his halfway episode. But this had your type of magic, which is like spell work.
Yes.
And witches and mages and like kind of sorcery sometimes works like this too. So how did you feel?
So the magic as a whole was simultaneously both the best part of this book and the worst part. And it just has to do with the execution. Now, what I thought was actually really neat about this book is, while it is very much kind of traditional witchcraft, like one of the things in a lot of witchcraft type stories is this idea of balance. In order to do one thing with magic, you have to kind of balance the equation with another, by doing maybe the opposite. And I found that to be very interesting. And then the way it actually works is they see these like golden threads. The witch can see these golden threads that basically each one of them represents a spell. And they kind of are negotiating with the land, I guess. It's not really clear. They call it the land, but it could be, but they also mention goddesses. So, but they are kind of negotiating these spells, and they're being like, well, I want to blind that person, and the balance is I have to blind myself. Or I want to burn that person, so I have to burn myself. Whereas the bad witches are like, oh, I'm going to burn that person. I'll just burn that other person too. And somehow that balances the equation. Or I'm going to hang this person, so I'm going to hang someone else too. That's a twofer. That's a perk. That's a feature. That's not balancing the equation. But when she had to burn herself or maybe ruin a relationship, a friendship, using magic, there actually you see the balance. So whenever our main character Lou does magic, the equation seems very balanced and understandable. But when everyone else does magic, it just seems like they can just do stuff. So maybe we have an unreliable narrator and who's telling us how magic works and they're getting it wrong. I don't know.
I'm not so sure either, but you brought up a lot of things that I was thinking too. So we have the witch's magic. That's the only magic that we know of in this story. And then there's different types of witches. I can't remember the name of the type of magic for the coven that Lou is from, but they're the Blanches, the white witches, basically. And they do this kind of, I'm going to call it rune magic, and I'll get to that in a second. And then there's the witches that use blood to do their magic. Those are the two types. We think that there's actually more types out there, but those haven't been explored yet. And so one thing that troubled me in this book was actually the author's phrasing of these threads, because the author said when the Dame Blanches, the white witches, did magic, they would see these kind of golden threads in the air, and then they would work themselves into a pattern, and the witches could read the pattern and know what to do. The author kept saying pattern over and over, but in my mind, that's a rune. And so I'm thinking this is just runes, and the author is trying to find a clever way to say it that's different, or they're trying to be different. So she's saying the pattern, but I found that to be extremely annoying to me, because I don't like renaming things that already have like a solid foundational name. Runes are used everywhere. You don't have to name it something else.
Yeah. And I didn't see runes at all or even the pattern. I just saw this idea of like she sees like three little golden cords and she can basically grab this one or she grabs this one. If she grabs this one, it does this effect. If she grabs this one, it does a different effect. And then during one action scene, she actually she's like, I don't like these choices, and she starts imagining a different scenario, and she almost negotiates, and suddenly a new chord just springs into existence, and then that's the lever she pulls. And
well, it's magical threads,
yeah,
and they're forming pictures. That's the pattern. So like the cables are, she says cords, but think of it almost like wisps, and they're arranging themselves different. So when she's moving those, she's just like, oh, I like this spell kind of, but this one has this piece, and she can kind of move them around in her head.
Yeah.
So that's runes. This part killed me. The calling it a pattern made me like crazy forever, and sometimes it's just a single thread, which means like she hasn't seen the pattern yet. The magic's there. It exists to get her out of the situation. But we know she's out of practice. So basically she's left her coven at 16, and then she's been gone for 2 years. She hasn't practiced magic during that time. Because another thing we haven't mentioned is magic gives off a very unique smell. I kept thinking it was like ozone when I was reading it, like sharp after lightning kind of smell. And the chasseurs are really trained to like sense it even in its like smallest, faintest smells. So she doesn't do it. She hasn't done it in 2 years, which could be why the golden threads she can see aren't forming into the runes very well.
Yeah. Or why hers are so almost self-destructive. Whereas the other witches, like, they're just, like, one of the opening scenes, there's, like, 3 witches, like, flying down Main Street, blasting people, trying to basically attack the nation itself in a fashion. And it's not like they were being harmed by their own magic. In fact, you actually learn very quickly in the course of the story, there's all these, like, innocent victims who are basically, in order for the witch to fly, this other person's going to be like crushed to the ground and have all their bones shattered. In order for them to cast this spell at someone else, this other person basically has what looks like bugs under their skin. Like, it was the way, the balancing of the magic, like I said, when other people did the magic seemed off. But the blood magic, they specifically say they don't have to balance anything. They just have to have blood. And the different types of blood do different things.
It does drain them, though. They get super tired. So the one blood witch we know in this story, she's also very identifiable, not by the smell of magic when she's working her smells as much as like the scars all over her body. Because when they do magic, they have to physically cut themselves, and they don't heal from that. So they end up with, like, especially their arms, that's a fast place to cut real quick, you know, if they're in a situation, are covered in scars. And then not only that, when they take their blood, it takes some sort of life force from them. At least for a while, they can get it back. So I actually like the Blood Witch the best in terms of magic, because that seemed the most balanced to me, as you say. I love that you say balanced. I come from the gaming world, and I'm like, we need some game devs in here to balance this magic system. But she mixes like her blood with lavender. Lavender is a common, like, calming, soothing sleep type of herb. She gives that to some dogs to calm them down at one point. And, like, everything that she uses, sage at one point, that's, like, a common, like, when you sage bad spirits, like, when she's trying to protect them in the woods. So it all made sense to me. That part was like, okay, I'm on board with this. Yeah. I struggled a bit more with the Dame Blanche magic.
And her magic, like I said, that's even more, like, traditional witch magic. It's like the title of that book next to you, Blood and Honey. She mixes blood with honey as almost like a healing salve. And so that was very interesting. Like I said, I like the implementation of the chord, or, you know, pattern magic as you describe it. I like the idea of that. It felt very cool. It's just the rules, as we were told, it seemed like the main character was operating on a different rule set from all the other witches. And it might be because she's untrained or less trained, but it felt like we're missing something here. And that I found that frustrating, but I'm actually, as I said, I think this is actually the best part of this book was the magic.
Yeah, pretty good. Love the blood magic. Love the magic in general. Mine is just there was some major holes for me, exactly like what you said. There's some explanation in certain points where they sort of tried to explain why witches turn into crones or turn into old hags, and it's because they do so much magic that eventually their body, everything's just depleted. Right, the eyesight goes, the hearing goes, the beauty goes, everything goes, and they end up like these meh. But then at one point it talks about some of the youth, some of the females in the town are getting like sapped dry, like their energy, their beauty, everything's taking out of them. And then I'm thinking, why are there old hags if you could just like suck it out of some young girl, which a witch did. So it was just all so very, very like not explained, unbalanced, as you said. So that really takes it down for me. But that's really it when it comes to the magic. How would you rate the magic system?
I would say for me, there was something special here. And so that got me excited and be like, hey, I want to learn more about this. And so I'm actually going to say this is a 4. This is,
Wow,
I was really excited
good.
about the magic of this world.
So I'm giving magic a 3. Mostly because of the white witch magic. I really struggled with that, and I don't know if it helped. Our female main character was not strong enough as it is, as a character. And then you have all these other witches around her just making her look not good at it. And I don't know why, and that I struggle with that. But yeah, the blood magic was cool, really cool. Love that. So yeah, 3 for me.
Okay.
This brings us into the writing. Another area just for our viewers, if you're used to us spending a ton of time on this, I'm not going to spend as much time today because we have other cool stuff to talk about. So writing in general, how did Shelby Mahurin do?
I felt like this book was a very easy read. It actually brings in a whole lot of French, or at least French-ish words. I don't know if they're real French words or they just have that French, sound. And I didn't have to like try to look anything up. Like even the word chasseur, like that could be a nonsense word for all I know. But I understood what it meant. I mean, they tell you very easily, or very quickly, but I kind of understood this setting very quickly. It has a very French vibe to it, as far as the way the story was or the words being used, the language, and yet it was still very accessible. It was fun to read this. I'll say that.
Yeah, similar. Easy to read, very accessible. The author was not near as gifted as the Gunmetal Gods author in terms of like when I was reading that book, even though I hated that book, I was like, this author can write. Like this author is like, this is cool to read his style. I did not feel like anything was cool, stood out. Like I felt like, I think this is her first book actually. And it felt like that. Not strong in any one way, not overly descriptive. So it was just kind of meh, but it was fun. But that's the story for me. The story was fun. The author did a good job pulling me in. There was I read this book in like a few hours. If I try to add up all my reading time, maybe 5 hours.
Wow.
Maybe 6.
Yeah.
Really fast. And that's because the story for me was fun. I was just pulled in. I guess that also means the writing is good.
Yeah.
Because it did that. But it wasn't more than good for me. So for me, it's a 3
I would
on
agree.
the writing style.
Definitely a
for
3
you?
as well.
One quick one that I didn't tell you about. My brain just remembered we need to do this. Spice level. Real quick. Spice. And I know you haven't read that much YA yet. Probably mostly just what I've given you. Scale of 1 to 5. How would you rank this on spicy, meaning the sexiness that they added to the story?
I would say going based on what we've already read, I would say this is more of a 3. There's definitely hotter scenes in Fourth Wing and like Dragonfall than what we get in this book. There's the one good sexy scene in this book, and it still feels on the more chaste side if you want to go for spicy.
Yeah, so the scene is a good scene. That's why I kept reading actually, because the slow burn in this book, for me the slow burn is so good. Like I'm just waiting for it. Like they get married, and I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, but they don't consummate the marriage. he hates her, she hates him. You know, the story has to unfold from there, and it does, but it does in a very slow burn way that I'm waiting for. I'm like, okay, consummate this marriage, let's go. And so like I kept reading because I was waiting for it. I know it's gonna have a spicy scene, so I'm like, well, let's go, let's read this. We get to the spicy scene, and it delivered. It was nice spice. It was fun to read. It had the necessary descriptions that make reading this type of new adult very fun. But yes, it had a purity to it. I'm going to use the word purity here because there was some wholesomeness along the way, despite some cussing that happens during it, of course, on Lou's part. But yes, so also 3. I've read spicier, and it was sweet, actually.
Yeah, it was a nice scene. It just wasn't as, I guess, hot as some of the other ones we've covered.
All right, so I gotta up it next time. All right, next up, we normally have a map to cover. There's no map, so we're not gonna rate the map today. I do want to mention that there actually are maps, just not in the book. So I don't know if that was an afterthought. I don't know if all the fan fiction started coming up, and there's a wiki for this. Yeah. And if you go to that webpage, you can find all of this and the city maps, and they're actually pretty darn decent. But, you know, we can't rate it because they are not included in the book, which is sad, actually, because those maps are pretty cool.
And they might be in some of the future books, but just not in this one.
Exactly. So this brings us to kind of the conclusion of how we feel about this book and whether or not we'd recommend it to our peers. And we usually do an S tier chart that shows you that. But before we do that, we're going to go into the story, which I feel kind of wraps us up and moves us to the S tier chart. We're not going to rank the story. We'll do that fully when we do the S tier. But Rob, the story of Lou and Reed and how their marriage ends up. How did you feel this book delivered on story?
So I know I've kind of, down put a lot of the elements of this book, like the way the relationship worked, the way the magic worked, the setting was being this kind of middle path between fantastical and real world. But the actual story itself was fun. I genuinely just kind of enjoyed the story as it was being told. Those, if you want to call them plot holes within the story, yeah, they're there, but they weren't enough to ruin the story for me like some of our other books have. I was able to just check into the story and just enjoy it. So it's written well for that reason.
Yeah, agree. I think once you get past that part that we keep talking about, the forced proximity, once you get past how they end up getting married, and you can get over that sort of loophole, which isn't that big of a deal. It just had to happen, as you say. Then it just gets super fun. Like, I'm enjoying the banter of this witch living under a witch hunter's nose. It's a story I haven't heard of before, which is more fun for me. Maybe this story exists out there and people have heard this too many times, but for me it was new. And for that being new, I had a grand old time. And it was good fun. And I find myself, when I'm rating a story, thinking, am I thinking about these characters after I've finished the book? Can any of these characters even be a book? Am I wanting to see what happens to them? And yes for Ansel, sort of yes for Coco. Mostly for Coco's magic. I want to see the Blood Coven, which we know comes after this book. We know the Blood Coven comes. So, and I want to learn all about that. And I find myself missing not having it. So I'm nervous, though, because everything I've read and all my friends that have read this say this is the best book. That it just goes downhill from here, and I'm like, no. But I have to. I have to do it. I have to find out about Ansel. I kind of want to ship Ansel and Coco. Like, I feel like they're meant to be together, although I don't know how old Coco is.
Yeah.
So...
And they're almost shipping Coco with a couple other relationships at the same time. She is a very well shipped character in this story, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. She's like, I mean, there's even a lot of what you might call gay baiting within this story, where there's a lot of implied relationship between Coco and Lou, and even other people. Like, Lou mentions she's been with a prostitute, whereas this story in no way implies that there are male prostitutes. So there's a lot of this kind of undertone to this story, kind of like the show Xena that you mentioned 2 weeks ago,
Yes.
where it's under the covers, but it's definitely frequently hinted at.
Yeah, and I think that's great to bring up right now too, because while this is not specifically referenced as like an LGBTQ friendly book, it is in there. And they say that the witches prefer the company of women,
At
and they
least some of
definitely
them do.
allude to it. Yeah. And so, well, they're also forced proximity when it comes to that too. So I believe that the book is going to explore those angles more, especially because this first book took place in the city, and we know that we're going to have a lot more of the blood coven in the next one. So I imagine we're going to get exposed to that more. So I think that's cool. We get a lot more exploration of the spicy tiers in the next book. But that moves us on to talking about how we're going to rate the book in general now that we've talked about liking the story. All right, so our S tier sheet. You can see how we've rated books before in the past, and I think it's interesting because the books that I've given you tend to be the books that you rate the lowest. But Fourth Wings was good for you, and Swordcatcher was, a little less than good. But I'm curious where this ranks among those recommendations.
I don't know. I still had like Face the Night and Dragonfall very high, but I don't know. My initial, I can't kind of came into this thinking that I was gonna go with the two, um, except for at the end of the day, as I just mentioned, I actually did enjoy the story. The story that was being told was interesting. There was a lot of novel elements to the story that I really enjoyed, such as the way the magic worked. Even when I had frustrating parts of this story, I still just enjoyed it. And so I'm gonna actually give this a 3. I think this is a good book.
Oh, that's fun to hear, Rob. We're slowly shedding that icy, grimdark heart, one YA romantasy at a time. So I'm actually similar. When I think about like a really good YA book, we haven't discussed some of my favorites on this show and what would be a 5 to me. But like the Throne of Glass series, which we haven't done, is a 5. I loved that series. First books are kind of rough. You got to hang in there with it. It gets you there. Fourth Wing wasn't as good as that, which is why it's a 4. And I kind of measure things off of like your Throne of Glass type stories. And also even some like really young YA, which isn't new adult, which is like the Shadowhunter series. I put that up there for 5 because I kept going with that beyond the main series. So I kind of had to think about it like that. Is this a Fourth Wing? Because that's what we've covered on the show. I gave Fourth Wing a 4. And it's not. It's not. I think it has a lot of potential. Her story has a ton of potential. It was hella fun to read. I had a great time. I blasted through it. But it's just a 3. It's a 3 for the holes in the magic system. It's a 3 for just some of the stories not being placed well in the beginning. It could have been done better. It could have been handled a bit better. But the author has something really, really cool here.
Yeah, and because like we never mentioned earlier, but like early on in the book, Lou and Coco, they go to one of these. It's an infirmary, but it's more of an asylum for victims of witches. And then you really get to see the negative side of the witchcraft. And I mean, you just watch them just like literally flying down Main Street, blasting people. And then you see these essentially innocent victims. And you're like, wow, there's something very sinister going on here. And it's all those little things that actually helped make this feel kind of like a fun, cool story the way it was built up.
Yeah, yeah, and another fun, cool part that I like, just as we're mentioning things that were just very interesting, when we talked about Lou's magic and the giving and taking and the balance, there was one area that I thought was very well balanced, which is she has memories of an ex-lover, or supposed ex-lover. And as she's taking away memories of some guards in a situation where she's got to get past some guards. She's taking away their memory of her being there. But in order to take away a memory from them, she has to take away memories from her. So she takes away memories of this kind of ex-lover who's a bit of a douche anyway. And she's like, yeah, I could let you go. That was a good time, buddy, but see ya. And then it's interesting because the author takes the time to tie that back in later when Reed actually asks her about ex-lovers. And she, even though he was a character, the ex-lover was a character in the beginning of the story, and we saw her hanging out with him, she was like, yeah, I don't really think that much went on there. Like,
Yeah.
and she's not lying. She actually did take it out of her brain. So that was like, this author has a lot of maturing to do, but I'm in it with her. I'd be interested to pick up a book that comes out after this series from this author. So good fun time, kind of up there with in terms of Face the Night, in terms of like good fun time. Had a great time reading it, but this to me had more missing layers than Face the Night did.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And you know, it's a good fun book. I would recommend it just for casual reading. You know, kind of gives you a nice fantasy story, and you know, a little bit of a romantic tale. So you know, it was fun. It was good.
So 3s for us both. And that concludes our wrap up of Serpent and Dove. I hope we were as no spoiler free as possible. And we hope that you've enjoyed your time with us.
Yeah, so please do us a favor, like and subscribe, you know, all the usual YouTube things. It really helps us.
And make sure to tune in next week as I cover Rob's book. I'm going to be doing the halfway review on The Nivola, which is a book that was actually recommended from a reader in our Discord. So make sure to also join our Discord, and we will see you next week. Thank you for coming.